So this video will deal with what you need to know about color for the web. It's not a detailed conversation on color theory because that could take a whole semester. I will point out some resources along the way for your further study. What I really want you to get out of this is how your file should be set up properly to display on the web and electronic devices, and what kind of terminology at a minimum you should know so that you could talk to a programmer or input these colors into CSS. I like this website, tiger.color, or I'm sorry, tigercolor.com. It has a nice basic, easy get started color theory section on it, starting with the wheel and taking you into more theory. And just know that you should become an expert on all things color theory as a designer. But for now, we're just going to cover a quick couple basic things that have to do with print, talk about the differences between that and web. So I'm guessing most of you have painted at one point in your life, even if it was just finger painting, and you probably learned that your primary colors for pigment-based color is your blue, your red, and your yellow. And you can mix those together to get these different colors in between. Commercial printing essentially takes the same theory, but it just the primary colors shift a little bit to CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and then they use the K from the black. Some great explanatory images that come up if you just Google CMYK printing process and you want to know more about it. But it's essentially these colors being applied to the paper most of the time in this order. But it's not just color, it's actually dots. So if you really zoom in on the image, you would see that this is actually what it's made of. Pretty fascinating, but beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here. So for web, we go into color that's built off of RGB, and that is red, green, blue. A great place to explain this color theory is right inside of Photoshop's color picker. So if I just double click on the foreground color here and go into the color picker, I can see that I have, like actually here's my CMYK, but what we're going to talk about for a little while right here is RGB. Now, the color mode behind RGB is what's known as additive, whereas pigment-based color, like your yellow, blue, and red, or your CMYK, is a subtractive process. That probably seems counterintuitive because you think, well, I mix those colors together, but they're talking about more about the way light interacts with them. So light bounces off of the paper, these colors subtract a certain amount, and what's left comes back to you. So that's the subtraction. In RGB, you can think of this as you having a red flashlight, a green flashlight, and a blue flashlight. And I mean that's the color light that it emits. So to show you this, what I'm going to do is zero out the green and zero out the blue, and now we have just a little bit of red showing. Now, one other thing that you have to keep in mind about RGB as compared to maybe CMYK is CMYK is a percentage-based system where if you deliver 100% cyan, let's say, then and you go 0 on everything else, then you're going to end up with pure cyan as your color. Now in web, RGB, it goes up to 255, and that's because in computer talk, to get the 256 different possibilities, you start with 0 and you move up to 255 being your max. So if I take this red and I crank it all the way up, that's the color that I obtain. Imagine you're in a dark room, you have your red flashlight, you turn it all the way on, this is the color you get. Now, if you turn off all of your flashlights, that makes a lot of sense, right? You pretty much know you're going to get black. If you turn on all of your flashlights full blast, that'd be 255 for all three of these colors. That probably makes sense that you're going to get white. It's the in-betweens that don't make nearly as much sense until you've experienced them. So imagine you take your red flashlight, now you turn on your green flashlight, and you cross the two of them so that they're blending equally together. You actually get yellow. So it's very counterintuitive from what you've experienced mixing colors. If you actually mix these two colors together in equal amounts, you'd probably get something pretty close to a brown. I'm going to leave this open and talk about 4 common ways that we specify colors for web and electronic devices. The first of those would be hexadecimal color, which is given right here, and that's a system that starts out with the pound sign and then 6 digits after that. And this will make a lot more sense to you if you think of it as being 3 pairs of numbers. So let me zero out all of these numbers again so that we get white. If we look at our hexadecimal code, it's telling us that we have 0 for all 3 numbers. Now, I'll start to crank up the red, and what you'll notice is the numbering system looks kind of familiar at first, but then once we get to 12, that's 0C. Well, the reason it puts numbers in there as well is that you need to be able to get 256 different numbers with only 2 digits. So with only 2 numerical digits, all we could come up with would be 100 different possibilities. So, and you really don't need to understand exactly or memorize any of these to be an effective web layout person. In fact, I don't think many coders even know hexadecimal numbering anymore. They probably have to learn it in the early part of their education. But anyway, you can see here as I'm cranking up the numbers, and I encourage you to experiment with all this stuff inside of Photoshop. But once I make my way all the way to the highest number possible, it's FF. So then if I go to blue and I just start adding different amounts of blue, we can see that the same thing happens to that last pair. And the more blue that I add, the closer we're going to get to a color that is very close to magenta. I'm going to mix up pure yellow here, and I want you to just keep both of these numbers in mind. In fact, if you have a piece of paper in front of you, you can go ahead and write these down, that RGB equals 255, 255, and 0, and that hex equals FF, FF, and 0, 0. So we'll get out of there for a while, and I want to take you out to another website. The second way, after the hexadecimal numbers, that you can use in web design, and this is a little bit, I want to say almost primitive way to design unless you're doing real simple design, but you can actually specify the color name in your code, and there is actually quite a few colors that are recognized by name. And I'll show you an example of code in just a minute here. And remember our yellow, so it is just called yellow, and there again is our mix. This is a great feature on this website, W3 Schools, which is a learning environment for web designers. Is you get to try things out on the fly, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So here is actually the CSS for the background of this page, and you can see you just put in the name of the color. So if I switch this over to red and I click on See Results, changes the color. So let's look at what we've talked about so far. So we mentioned the actual name of the color, and then as we mentioned, we can do hexadecimal, which you need to start off with the pound sign. That's just like announcing that, yep, this is a hexadecimal number, and that first 2 were max and the last one was zeros. Click on See Result, and nothing should change because we went from yellow to yellow. And just to make sure this is working, of course, we could just go switch that to FF temporarily. Yep. Okay, so everything's working as we expect here. I want to specify a color in RGB. I just simply put in RGB, and then in between the parentheses, I put in 3 pairs the numbers. So right now this should give me black if I click See Result, And then if I crank this up to 255, that should give me red. And crank this one up all the way, should give me yellow. And then a fourth option that we have that's pretty common nowadays, becoming more and more popular every day, is RGBA, which supports transparency. So that's red, green, blue, and then alpha, which is a common synonym for transparency. So we just put in another comma there, and then we put in a number between 0 and 1. 0 would mean none of the color, which would be pretty useless to us. That would just be essentially white. So we typically use this starting with the 0 and then a decimal. And so let's say I put in 3, that's going to be 30% or 3/10 of yellow. And if I click see results, that's what we get. If I bump this up to, let's say, 6, it should be that much more so. And if we were working in a way that there could be like another object under here, then we would see through this, 40% see-through, like looking through a yellow piece of glass. Let's make use of all that information now and pretend that we need to make a graphic in Photoshop. So how do we set it up? So we'll go File, New. Now we could select under Document Type Web, and that'll help us get a little bit closer to where we need to go. But it gives us some preset sizes. So let's just know that, or let's just say that we know we needed to design something within a 100 pixel by 100 pixel area. As we've learned previously, the resolution really doesn't make any difference when we're talking about pixel size. We want RGB as our color mode, right? That's the one for web. And then background contents, if you need to make something that supports transparency, make sure that that's set to transparent. Otherwise, white might be a fine choice for the background. You can't go wrong actually picking transparent because you can always color it anyway. And then under advanced, you want the color profile to be sRGB. So that's a specific type of RGB, and this just stands for standard RGB. And then I don't believe there's any choices other than this RGB, so you'll get used to seeing this. And then we want our pixel aspect ratio to be square pixels. And then with this new document, we're ready to design away. In the next video, we'll take this knowledge and we'll apply it to if we're given an image or if we're manipulating images.